The November fog pressed against the windows of our Baker Street lodgings like a living thing, and I found Holmes seated before the fire, his violin bow dancing across the strings in a melancholy air that seemed to echo the dreary weather outside. His grey eyes were fixed upon a telegram that lay crumpled beside his chair, and I recognized the signs of a mind already engaged with some new puzzle. "Watson," he said without looking up from his instrument. "Observe the mud upon your left boot, Whitechapel clay, mixed with sawdust from Brennan's butcher shop, and unless I am mistaken, a trace of carbolic acid from your medical rounds. You have been treating the Henley child's infected wound, have you not?" I paused in removing my coat, once again marveled by his casual display of deductive reasoning. "Indeed, Holmes. The boy is recovering well, though his mother remains anxious. Naturally, maternal instinct rarely yields to medical assurance." He set down his violin and reached for the telegram. "However, I fear we have a more pressing matter at hand. Inspector Lestrade has summoned us to Bloomsbury, where a most peculiar death has occurred under circumstances that have left Scotland Yard completely baffled." Before I could inquire further, Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed upon the stairs, followed by the heavier tread of official boots. Inspector Lestrade entered, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had encountered something beyond his considerable experience. Behind him came a gentleman of middle years, impeccably dressed, despite the evident strain that marked his features. His gloves bore faint traces of a peculiar green powder that caught the lamplight. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade began, removing his hat with unusual solemnity. "May I present Sir Edmund Blackwood, curator of the Meridian Gallery. We have a death that defies all explanation." Sir Edmund stepped forward, clutching a leather portfolio with trembling hands. "Gentlemen, Lord Ashford was discovered this morning in the east wing of our gallery, dead in circumstances so extraordinary that I scarcely know how to describe them. He was found seated before the Venetian Mask of Sorrows, a 15th-century artifact of considerable value and, according to legend, considerable malevolence." Holmes leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "The cause of death? Unknown," Lestrade replied grimly. "No wounds, no signs of violence, no apparent cause whatsoever. The physician could only suggest cardiac failure brought on by extreme terror, though what could have frightened a man of Lord Ashford's constitution remains a mystery." "The room was secured?" Holmes inquired. "Locked from within," Sir Edmund confirmed. "The key was found in Lord Ashford's own pocket. The windows were latched, the skylight bolted shut, yet at precisely midnight, according to the night watchman, he heard what he described as a sound like breaking glass, followed by a low, mournful laugh that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves." Sir Edmund opened his portfolio with shaking fingers, revealing fragments of painted porcelain, brilliant blues and golds mixed with deep crimson. The mask was found shattered upon the floor beside him, as if it had fallen from its display case. But the case itself showed no signs of tampering, and the mask had been secured with silk cords that were found severed, as though cut from within. Holmes examined the fragments with his magnifying glass, noting the peculiar green residue that clung to several pieces. "Malachite powder," he murmured, "used in certain restoration processes, but also in more arcane applications. Tell me, Sir Edmund, had Lord Ashford received any threats recently?" "Indeed," the curator replied, producing a series of letters from his case. Anonymous correspondence warning him against displaying the mask publicly. The writer claimed it carried an ancient curse that would claim any who dared disturb its rest. The fire crackled in the grate as Holmes rose, his movements sharp with decision. "Watson, your coat. Inspector, I shall need to examine the scene immediately, and I suggest you bring your most reliable constables. If there is indeed a curse at work here, it is one written in very human hand, and I intend to read every word of its deception." The fog swirled about us as we descended into the London night. bound for whatever dark secrets awaited us in the halls of the Meridian Gallery. The Meridian Gallery emerged from the November fog like a temple dedicated to forgotten mysteries, its Georgian columns standing sentinel against the yellow-tinged darkness that had swallowed Bloomsbury whole. Our hansom cab drew to a halt before the imposing entrance, where gas lamps flickered weakly against the oppressive atmosphere, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe across the building's classical facade. Holmes stepped down first, his keen eyes immediately scanning the worn stone steps beneath our feet, noting details that would have escaped lesser observers entirely. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, kneeling briefly to examine faint markings in the damp stone. "Recent activity indeed. Multiple visitors within the past few days, yet Sir Edmund assures us the gallery has been closed to public viewing since Monday last." Inspector Lestrade fumbled with his keys, the metallic jingling seeming unnaturally loud in the fog-muffled street, while Sir Edmund stood beside him, still clutching his leather portfolio with hands that trembled slightly in the cold night air. "I do hope, Mr. Holmes, that you can make sense of this dreadful business," the curator said, his voice carrying the strain of a man who had witnessed something beyond his considerable experience. Lord Ashford was not merely a patron but a dear friend, and to lose him under such circumstances. Holmes straightened, brushing moisture from his coat with characteristic precision. "Fear not, Sir Edmund. In my experience, the more bizarre the circumstances appear, the more mundane the explanation often proves to be. The human mind delights in embracing the sensational, but it is our task to peel away these theatrical flourishes and expose the mechanism beneath." The heavy oak doors swung open with a groan that echoed through the marble-floored entrance hall, where portraits of long-dead benefactors gazed down upon us with oil-painted eyes that caught our lamplight with unsettling intensity. The air within carried a peculiar mixture of old wood, varnish, and something else, a faint metallic scent that stirred my medical instincts uneasily. Holmes paused at the threshold, his nostrils flaring slightly as he detected the same odor that had caught my attention. "Copper salts," he observed quietly, with traces of something more complex. "Watson, your medical training, what does that particular combination suggest to you?" I considered the question carefully, drawing upon my knowledge of chemistry and toxicology. "Certain compounds used in restoration work, perhaps, though the metallic component suggests something more reactive." Lestrade led us through a series of interconnected galleries, past cases filled with ancient artifacts and walls lined with paintings whose subjects seemed to follow our progress with painted gazes. Holmes moved with that peculiar gliding step of his, already absorbed in observation, pausing occasionally to examine details that escaped my notice entirely. At one point, he stopped before a display case containing medieval jewelry, his attention caught by something specific. "The security arrangements, Sir Edmund?" he inquired without turning from his examination. "Two-night watchman, Mr. Holmes. Morrison, our senior man, makes his rounds every 2 hours, checking each room methodically. Young Peters remains at the front desk throughout the night. Both have been with us for years and are absolutely trustworthy." Holmes nodded absently, producing his magnifying glass to examine the lock mechanism of the jewelry case more closely. "And your restoration staff?" he continued, straightening. "We employ only one specialist currently, Miss Catherine Pembroke, a most accomplished young woman who studied conservation techniques in Florence. She has been working extensively with our Venetian collection these past months." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. "Indeed. And was she familiar with the Mask of Sorrows specifically?" Sir Edmund shifted uncomfortably. "She had expressed particular interest in it, yes. The piece required delicate attention, some of the original pigments had begun to fade, and there were concerns about the stability of certain decorative elements. We reached the East Wing at last, where the scene of Lord Ashford's mysterious death awaited our examination, and I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation that always accompanied the beginning of one of Holmes's most intricate investigations. The East Wing opened before us like a shrine to some forgotten mystery, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to press down upon the scene of Lord Ashford's inexplicable demise. The room stretched 30 feet in length, lined with glass cases that reflected our lamplight in fractured patterns, while at its center stood the focal point of our investigation, an ornate pedestal draped in midnight blue velvet, now bearing only the scattered fragments of what had once been the legendary Mask of Sorrows. The chair, where Lord Ashford had met his end, remained positioned exactly as death had found him, though the body had been removed that morning, leaving only the impression of terror that seemed to linger in the very air itself. Holmes moved with that peculiar gliding step that marked the beginning of his most intensive investigations, his keen eyes absorbing every detail while the rest of us remained frozen in the doorway. The metallic scent we had detected earlier was far more pronounced here, mixed with something else that stirred my medical instincts uneasily, a faint sweetness that reminded me of certain chemical compounds I had encountered during my toxicology studies. "The pattern of the glass fragments, Watson," Holmes murmured, kneeling beside the scattered remains of the mask, his magnifying glass catching the lamplight as he examined each piece with methodical precision. "Note how they radiate from a single point of failure, suggesting an internal fracture rather than external force." He lifted one of the larger fragments with his gloved fingers, tilting it toward the light to reveal that peculiar green powder we had observed earlier, which seemed to cling to the painted surface with almost magnetic persistence. "Malachite, certainly, but with additives that speak of more modern chemistry than 15th century Venetian artisans would have employed," he observed, carefully sealing a sample in an envelope from his waistcoat. The severed silk cords lay nearby, their ends bearing that curious frayed appearance that Sir Edmund had mentioned, and Holmes examined these with equal attention, touching one end briefly to his tongue before making a note in his pocketbook. "Sir Edmund," Holmes said without looking up from his examination. "You're Miss Pembroke. She has been working extensively with restoration chemicals, I presume." Before the curator could answer, footsteps echoed in the corridor, and the young woman herself appeared in the doorway, her dark serge dress impeccable despite the late hour, though I could not help but notice the faint green staining beneath her fingernails and the small burn mark upon her left index finger that spoke of recent contact with caustic substances. "Miss Pembroke," Holmes continued, rising to his full height, "you mentioned that the mask's binding cords were fragile. In your professional opinion, what might cause silk to deteriorate in such a specific pattern?" The young woman stepped forward with admirable composure, though her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them before her. "Certain chemical vapors can weaken natural fibers, Mr. Holmes, particularly when combined with moisture and heat. I had recommended replacing the cords entirely, but Lord Ashford was most insistent about viewing the reverse inscriptions immediately." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then moved to examine the display case that had housed the mask, his attention caught by almost invisible scratches around the lock mechanism that spoke of recent tampering. "These cases have been opened within the past few days," he announced, producing his magnifying glass to study the lock more closely. Lestrade stepped forward impatiently. "But surely, Mr. Holmes, the locked room presents the real puzzle here. How could anyone have entered or escaped when the door was locked from within and the key found in Lord Ashford's own pocket?" Holmes smiled that enigmatic smile that always preceded his most brilliant deductions. "My dear Inspector, locked rooms are rarely as impregnable as they appear. Observe the fresh oil upon this lock mechanism applied recently to ensure silent operation, and note these minute metal filings embedded in the doorframe, suggesting the use of specialized tools." He moved to the windows, testing each latch methodically before pausing at one particular frame, where faint scratches marked the wood around the catch. External entry was indeed attempted here, though whether successfully remains to be determined. The investigation was revealing its first concrete clues, yet the mystery seemed to deepen with each discovery, drawing us further into a web of deception that would test even Holmes's remarkable powers of deduction. Holmes straightened from his examination of the window frame, his keen eyes reflecting that particular intensity that marked his most productive moments of observation. The lamplight revealed additional details. As he adjusted his position, minute fragments of dark fabric caught upon the window latch, and traces of the same peculiar green powder that had adorned the shattered mask fragments. He produced a small envelope from his waistcoat and carefully collected these samples, his movements precise and methodical. "The pattern of deterioration in these silk cords," he murmured, kneeling once more beside the pedestal, "suggests exposure to a volatile acid, applied in droplets to exploit the natural weaknesses in the fiber until they parted of their own accord." With his magnifying glass, he examined the velvet draping more closely, revealing tiny crystalline deposits that sparkled like frost in the lamplight. "Watson, observe this residue upon the chair arms, a chemical compound designed to ensure rapid absorption through the skin." I leaned closer, detecting that same sickly sweetness we had noticed earlier, now more pronounced near the chair where Lord Ashford had met his end. "Something related to the cyanogen family, perhaps," I suggested, drawing upon my medical knowledge. "Precisely," Holmes confirmed. "A substance that would affect the heart before a man could cry out in alarm." Miss Pembroke shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly before her, and I noticed how her gaze flickered nervously between Holmes and Inspector Lestrade. "If I may, gentlemen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there is something I must tell you about Lord Ashford's visit yesterday evening. He was not alone when he arrived." The statement fell upon our small group with the force of a physical blow, and Lestrade stepped forward, his patience clearly strained. "Why was this not mentioned earlier, miss?" She wrung her hands, the green staining beneath her fingernails more visible now in the lamplight. "He specifically requested that his companion's presence remain confidential, a lady of considerable social standing, whose reputation would suffer if her interest in certain occult matters became public knowledge." Holmes turned from his examination with sharp attention, his grey eyes fixed upon the young woman with renewed interest. "Describe this lady, if you please." Miss Pembroke's composure faltered slightly as she continued. Tall and elegantly dressed in deep purple silk, with auburn hair arranged in the latest fashion. She wore a distinctive brooch, a silver serpent with emerald eyes, and carried herself with the bearing of one accustomed to command. Sir Edmund's face paled visibly at this description, and he clutched his leather portfolio with trembling hands. "Lady Vivienne Ashcroft," he whispered. "Lord Ashford's former fiancée. Their engagement was dissolved under rather scandalous circumstances some months ago." Holmes began pacing the length of the room, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic gesture that indicated his mind was working at full capacity. "Scandalous in what manner?" Sir Edmund glanced nervously at Miss Pembroke before continuing. "There were allegations of her involvement with certain spiritualist societies, séances, and other practices that Lord Ashford found deeply disturbing. The dissolution was quite acrimonious, with threats exchanged on both sides." Lestrade, meanwhile, had focused his attention on Miss Pembroke with growing suspicion. "You have intimate knowledge of the mask's composition, miss, and you were present in the gallery last night. The evidence against you is becoming quite compelling." Holmes paused in his pacing to examine something near the base of the window frame, a small brass key that had somehow escaped earlier notice, partially concealed beneath the heavy velvet draping. Unlike the standard keys used throughout the gallery, this one bore intricate engravings and showed signs of recent manufacture, despite its deliberately aged appearance. He pocketed it quietly before anyone else could, examine it closely, then moved to investigate a nearly imperceptible smudge on the polished marble floor near the pedestal. With a delicate instrument from his kit, he carefully scraped a minute sample into a small vial, his action suggesting he had discovered something significant that had eluded the rest of us entirely. The web of relationships and motives was becoming increasingly complex, with Lady Ashcroft's mysterious presence adding a new dimension to the case while the circumstantial evidence against Miss Pembroke continued to mount in Lestrade's methodical mind. Yet I could see from Holmes's expression that we were still far from understanding the true mechanism of this elaborate deception. Holmes continued his methodical examination of the crime scene, his movements deliberate and precise as he collected samples that would have seemed insignificant to lesser observers. The brass key remained secure in his waistcoat pocket, its significance known only to him as he knelt beside the pedestal to scrape minute traces of the peculiar dust that had settled upon the midnight blue velvet. His long fingers worked with the delicacy of a surgeon, sealing each sample in carefully labeled envelopes, while maintaining the appearance of casual investigation that often disarmed the most guarded witnesses. Miss Pembroke stood trembling near the doorway, her composure finally beginning to crack under the mounting pressure of Lestrade's suspicious glances and the weight of her own concealed knowledge. The green staining beneath her fingernails seemed more pronounced in the lamplight, and the small burn mark upon her index finger spoke eloquently of recent contact with caustic restoration chemicals. "Miss Pembroke," Holmes said gently, not looking up from his examination of the shattered mask fragments, "you mentioned Lord Ashford's urgency regarding the completion of your restoration work. Was there a particular deadline that concerned him?" The young woman's hands twisted nervously in her dark serge skirt as she struggled to maintain her professional demeanor. "He intended to unveil the mask at a private exhibition next week, Mr. Holmes, a special showing of Venetian antiquities for potential benefactors. The mask, with its legendary curse, was to be the centerpiece, drawing considerable attention and patronage to the gallery." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke of her professional work, finding refuge in familiar territory. The inscriptions on the reverse side had been obscured by centuries of overpainting, and my chemical solvents were gradually revealing text that Lord Ashford claimed would authenticate the mask's supernatural reputation. Sir Edmund stepped forward, his weathered face bearing the strain of watching his carefully ordered institution dissolve into chaos. "The inscriptions were indeed remarkable, Mr. Holmes, ancient Venetian, mixed with Latin phrases speaking of binding spirits and controlling the souls of the departed. Lord Ashford became quite agitated when Miss Pembroke translated them, claiming they confirmed his worst suspicions about certain individuals and their involvement with occult practices." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, producing his magnifying glass to examine the lock mechanism of the nearby display case with renewed interest, noting fresh scratches that indicated recent use of an unfamiliar key. "Sir Edmund," Holmes continued, his voice carrying that deceptively casual tone that often preceded his most significant discoveries, "your security arrangements are all keys properly accounted for." The curator fumbled through his keyring with growing alarm, counting each one twice before looking up with evident distress. "There should be 7 keys to the various display cases, Mr. Holmes, but I count only 6. The key to the Venetian collection case appears to be missing." The revelation struck our small group with the force of a physical blow, and Miss Pembroke's face drained of all color as she sank into the very chair where Lord Ashford had met his mysterious end. "I gave it to her," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast room as her professional facade finally crumbled completely. "Lady Ashcroft claimed she had Sir Edmund's permission to examine the mask privately, and she offered me £20 for a few hours' access after closing. I needed the money desperately. My mother's medical expenses have consumed my entire savings, and I saw no harm in allowing a brief, private viewing." Lestrade stepped forward with evident satisfaction, his suspicions about the young woman's involvement seemingly confirmed by this admission of complicity. Holmes, however, continued his methodical examination, testing a small sample of the crystalline residue with a chemical reagent that produced a telltale blue coloration, before sealing the evidence away. "The inscriptions you uncovered, Miss Pembroke, in your professional opinion, were they authentically ancient, or might they have been added more recently by someone with knowledge of classical languages?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication, as the web of deception continued to reveal itself, thread by carefully woven thread, drawing us ever deeper into a mystery that would test even Holmes's remarkable powers of deduction to their absolute limits. Miss Pembroke lifted her tear-stained face, struggling to maintain the professional composure that had served her so well throughout her career in restoration work. "The inscriptions troubled me greatly, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke of her expertise. While the pigments appeared authentically aged, certain elements were decidedly modern synthetic ultramarine mixed with genuine malachite and binding agents that included shellac rather than traditional egg tempera. More concerning still, the Latin phrases contained grammatical structures unknown to 15th-century scribes, and the letter formations bore the polish of a university-educated gentleman rather than a Venetian artisan's hand. She paused, wringing her hands as the implications of her professional assessment became clear. "I informed Lord Ashford of these inconsistencies, but rather than disappointment, he showed considerable excitement, claiming the truth would prove more dangerous than any legend." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his keen eyes reflecting that particular intensity that marked significant developments in his investigations. "More dangerous indeed," he murmured, moving once again to examine the window frame with renewed purpose. Using his pocket knife with surgical precision, he carefully pried loose a small fragment of beeswax that had been pressed into an almost invisible crevice in the brass fittings, holding it up to the lamplight to reveal the clear impression of an ornate key. "Observe, Watson, someone has taken a mold of the window latch mechanism, presumably to create a duplicate for unauthorized entry. This suggests a level of premeditation that transforms our case from a crime of passion into something far more calculating." Lestrade, meanwhile, had produced his notebook and was recording Miss Pembroke's confession with evident satisfaction, his face bearing the expression of a man who believed conventional police methods had solved yet another baffling case. "The evidence is quite clear, Mr. Holmes," he announced with growing confidence. "Lady Ashcroft had both motive and opportunity. Miss Pembroke provided the means through her misguided assistance, and the method, however bizarre, aligns perfectly with Lord Ashford's sudden death. We have our primary suspect, and I shall dispatch constables to her residence immediately." Sir Edmund stepped forward with visible relief, clearly grateful that suspicion had shifted away from his employee and his gallery's security arrangements. "Lady Vivienne Ashcroft has always been given to eccentric behavior. Inspector," he offered eagerly. "Her involvement with spiritualist societies and occult practices was well known in certain circles, and her temperament after the broken engagement was decidedly volatile. I can provide you with her current address and a detailed description of her appearance." Holmes, however, had returned his attention to the shattered remains of the mask, kneeling beside the fragments with that methodical patience that often preceded his most brilliant deductions. He lifted one of the larger pieces, turning it slowly in the lamplight while examining the broken edges with his magnifying glass. "These fracture patterns are most instructive, Watson," he observed quietly. "Note the pristine sharpness of these edges, a clean break quite unlike the splintering one might expect from a ceramic object falling onto marble flooring. The breakage suggests internal structural weakness, perhaps deliberately introduced during the restoration process." Moving to the exact position where Lord Ashford's chair had been placed, Holmes produced his tape measure and began calculating distances with mathematical precision, measuring from the fragments to the chair, then to the display case, and finally to various points around the room. His actions were deliberate and entirely detached from Lestrade's excited preparations for Lady Ashcroft's arrest. "The acoustics of this gallery are quite remarkable," he commented, seemingly to himself. "A sound originating from one location might easily be perceived as coming from another, particularly by a listener positioned in the corridor outside." Returning to the display case, Holmes focused his attention on minute scratches around the lock mechanism that spoke of recent tampering, then examined the adjacent wall paneling with particular interest. Using a thin instrument from his kit, he carefully probed an almost invisible seam in the woodwork, revealing a hair-thin wire. coated with a dark, oily substance that disappeared into the wall itself. He severed a small sample with surgical scissors, sealing it in a separate vial while Lestrade called back from the doorway. "We'll have Lady Ashcroft in custody by morning, Mr. Holmes. This case appears quite straightforward after all." His attention fixed upon the minuscule wire and the growing collection of evidence that suggested the seemingly perfect narrative unfolding before them was altogether too convenient for his discerning taste. Holmes continued his examination of the hair-thin wire with that methodical precision that marked his most significant investigations, following its path along the wall paneling, while Lestrade remained occupied with preparations for Lady Ashcroft's arrest. The oily coating produced a distinctive metallic odor when exposed to lamplight, and I recognized the expression that crossed his angular features, the look of a man whose understanding of the case had fundamentally shifted. Using a delicate probe from his investigative kit, he traced the wire to where it disappeared through an almost imperceptible hole in the ornate woodwork, noting how the surrounding area bore microscopic tool marks that spoke of recent and careful drilling. "Watson," he murmured, ensuring his voice would not carry to the inspector. "Observe how this mechanism extends beyond our immediate crime scene. The sophistication suggests considerable preparation and intimate knowledge of the gallery's construction." Moving with that peculiar gliding step, Holmes approached the eastern wall, running his hands along the carved molding until his fingers detected a subtle depression in the woodwork. With gentle pressure applied at precisely the correct angle, a narrow section of paneling swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a service passage that connected to the administrative offices beyond. The passage bore unmistakable signs of recent use, fresh scuff marks on the dusty floor and traces of that familiar green powder we had encountered throughout our investigation. Sir Edmund stepped forward with visible alarm, his weathered face draining of color as the implications became apparent. "That passage was sealed decades ago during renovations," he whispered. "I had no knowledge it remained functional, though it would provide access to the gallery's heating and ventilation systems." Holmes produced his pocket torch, illuminating the narrow space between walls, where an intricate arrangement of wires and pulleys spoke of careful engineering and considerable mechanical knowledge. At the passage's far end, barely visible in the confined space, stood a complex brass device that resembled a modified clockwork mechanism, its gears gleaming dully in the torchlight. "Our mysterious midnight laugh," Holmes observed with quiet satisfaction, examining the apparatus more closely without disturbing its delicate arrangement. A music box movement adapted to produce specific sounds at predetermined intervals, activated when supporting wires were severed by chemical deterioration. The revelation struck our small group with profound impact, and Miss Pembroke sank into the nearest chair, her hands covering her face as the scope of the deception became clear. "Someone has been using my restoration work as cover for an elaborate scheme," she whispered through her fingers, her professional pride wounded as deeply as her conscience. The chemical solvents, the late-night access, and the urgency about completing those inscriptions, all orchestrated to create perfect circumstances for Lord Ashford's death. Tears of anger mixed with remorse as she contemplated how her expertise had been manipulated by someone who understood both her financial desperation and her dedication to her craft. Holmes emerged from the passage with several additional samples sealed in evidence envelopes, his grey eyes reflecting the satisfaction of a puzzle solver who had identified crucial missing pieces. "The true genius of this scheme lies not in its complexity, but in its misdirection," he announced, brushing dust from his coat with characteristic precision. "While we focus attention on Lady Ashcroft's mysterious presence and Miss Pembroke's chemical knowledge, the actual perpetrator has been orchestrating events from a position of apparent respectability." He turned to examine the heating vents positioned high along the gallery walls, noting how their placement would create specific air currents when the system operated at elevated temperatures. "Sir Edmund, your heating arrangements, they can be controlled from the administrative offices?" The curator nodded nervously. "The main controls are located in my office, though individual room temperatures can be adjusted locally. Holmes measured distances between the vents and the pedestal with his tape, making calculations that seemed to confirm some private theory. "Inspector," Holmes called to Lestrade, who remained focused on his arrest preparations. "Your pursuit of Lady Ashcroft, while understandable given the circumstantial evidence, represents precisely the misdirection our true culprit intended. The missing key, her presence here yesterday evening, even those threatening letters, all carefully arranged to draw suspicion away from someone whose position grants both access and credibility." The mechanical device continued its soft ticking from within the hidden passage, marking time like a metallic heartbeat that underscored the growing tension as Holmes prepared to reveal the true architect of Lord Ashford's impossible death. Holmes turned from his examination of the mechanical device with that expression of quiet satisfaction that marked the convergence of theory and evidence, his grey eyes reflecting the lamplight as he emerged from the hidden passage with dust upon his coat and revelation upon his lips. "Inspector," he said, his voice carrying an authority that instantly commanded attention, "your pursuit of Lady Ashcroft, while superficially logical, represents precisely the misdirection our true perpetrator intended. The evidence against her has been as carefully orchestrated as the crime itself, designed to draw attention away from someone whose position grants both access and unquestioned credibility." Lestrade paused in his preparations, his weathered face reflecting the skepticism of a practical policeman confronted with theoretical complications. "Mr. Holmes, with respect, the evidence appears overwhelming motive, opportunity, and means all point toward Lady Ashcroft. Your mechanical contraptions merely confirm the elaborate nature of her scheme." Holmes smiled, that enigmatic expression that always preceded his most devastating revelations, moving to examine Sir Edmund with renewed attention to details that had previously seemed insignificant. "Consider the practical requirements of this crime, Inspector," Holmes replied, his tone conversational yet penetrating. "Our perpetrator required intimate knowledge of the gallery's construction, access to specialized restoration chemicals, familiarity with mechanical devices, and most crucially, the ability to move through these premises without arousing the slightest suspicion." He paused, allowing the implications to settle upon our small group before continuing with surgical precision. "Lady Ashcroft, despite her eccentricities, possesses none of these qualifications, while someone among us has demonstrated expertise in every area." Sir Edmund stepped forward with growing alarm, his leather portfolio clutched defensively against his chest as Holmes's meaning became increasingly apparent. The curator's hands trembled slightly, and I noticed how his eyes avoided direct contact with Holmes's penetrating gaze, while the green staining beneath his fingernails, which I had initially attributed to handling the mask, fragments now seemed far more significant in light of these revelations. "Surely you cannot suggest that I would murder one of my most generous benefactors," he protested, his voice carrying wounded dignity, though lacking genuine conviction. Holmes produced his magnifying glass, examining the curator's clothing with clinical detachment before moving to inspect the heating controls near the gallery entrance. "The chemical staining upon your gloves matches precisely the compounds found throughout this crime scene, Sir Edmund, while the burn mark upon your thumb indicates recent contact with caustic substances identical to those Miss Pembroke uses in her restoration work." He tested various settings on the heating panel, and I felt the subtle change in air circulation that would have been crucial to the crime's timing. "More telling still, the dust patterns upon your clothing suggest considerable time spent within that hidden passage, presumably making final adjustments to your elaborate mechanism." Before Sir Edmund could respond, a sharp cry echoed from the corridor, followed by the sound of a body striking the marble floor. We hurried toward the commotion to find Peters, the young watchman, collapsed beneath a high ventilation grate, his face pale and clammy, his breathing shallow and irregular. A faint sweetness tainted the air around him, and Holmes immediately pressed his handkerchief to his face while thrusting another at me. "Back, Watson. Open that window and keep low. Someone has activated the heating system to release vapors through the vents." I knelt beside the young man, detecting the rapid, irregular pulse that spoke of chemical poisoning, while Holmes scaled a nearby ladder to examine the ventilation grate above. "A felt pad soaked with volatile compounds," he reported grimly, "designed to disperse when heated air passes through the system. An admirable attempt to silence a witness who might have observed midnight movements, timed to coincide with our investigation." His eyes narrowed as he descended, fixing upon Sir Edmund with cold intensity. "Someone advanced the heating controls from the administrative offices, knowing we would gather here. The question remains, who possessed both the knowledge and the desperate motivation to attempt murder twice in as many days?" I attended to Peters with practiced efficiency, checking his pulse and breathing while the cold November air gradually cleared the toxic vapors from his system. The young watchman's color slowly returned to normal, and his breathing deepened as the chemical compounds released their grip upon his constitution. "Easy now," I murmured, supporting him as he struggled to sit upright against the gallery wall. "You've had a close encounter with some very dangerous substances, but you're recovering well." Holmes knelt beside us, his keen eyes studying the young man's face with that particular intensity that marked crucial moments in his investigations. "Peters," Holmes said gently, his voice carrying the authority that commanded immediate attention, "I need you to tell us exactly what you observed last night, particularly around the time you heard the heating system activate." The watchman nodded weakly, his hand trembling as he accepted the glass of water I offered him. "It was just past 11, sir, when I heard the mechanical sounds from the administrative corridor, not the usual settling noises, but deliberate movements, like someone operating the heating controls." His voice grew stronger as he continued, the importance of his testimony becoming clear. "I saw light beneath Mr. Blackwood's office door, which struck me as odd since he'd left hours earlier, and when I approached to investigate, the air began to turn foul with that sickly sweet smell." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Lestrade, who immediately dispatched constables to secure the administrative offices while we remained with Peters. "Timing corresponds exactly with our perpetrator's attempt to eliminate a witness," Holmes observed, helping the young man to his feet. "Your observations may well have saved your life, Peters, by forcing you to retreat before the full concentration of vapors could take effect." With Peters safely in the care of a constable, Holmes led our group toward Sir Edmund's office, the curator following with obvious reluctance and growing alarm. The office revealed its secrets under Holmes's methodical examination, each discovery adding another piece to the complex puzzle of deception and murder. Behind locked drawers, we found an array of tools that spoke eloquently of criminal enterprise. Delicate brushes stained with the same green malachite powder we had encountered throughout our investigation, bottles of chemical solvents identical to those used in Miss Pembroke's restoration work, and most damning of all, a jeweler's loupe and precision instruments used for detailed forgery work. Holmes examined each item with his magnifying glass, noting how the tool marks matched those we had observed on the mechanical device and the window frame. "The financial records tell an even more compelling story," Holmes announced, spreading the ledgers across Sir Edmund's desk with surgical precision. "Observe these discrepancies. Watson donations pledged but never received. Insurance valuations that exceed the actual worth of displayed pieces. And most significantly, a pattern of authentic artifacts being quietly replaced by skillful reproductions." Sir Edmund's face grew increasingly pale as Holmes traced the evidence of systematic deception spanning several years, each forgery more elaborate than the last. "Lord Ashford discovered your scheme, didn't he?" Holmes continued, his grey eyes fixed upon the curator with unwavering intensity. His growing expertise in Venetian artifacts, combined with Miss Pembroke's chemical analysis, threatened to expose not merely the mask of Sorrow's forgery, but your entire network of deception. Sir Edmund clutched his leather portfolio with desperate hands, his carefully maintained facade finally beginning to crack under the weight of irrefutable evidence and Holmes's relentless logic. The truth was emerging with mathematical precision, each revelation building upon the last toward an inevitable conclusion that would test even Sir Edmund's considerable powers of self-deception. Sir Edmund's carefully constructed facade finally shattered like the porcelain mask that had been central to his elaborate deception, his trembling hands releasing the leather portfolio as Holmes's relentless logic stripped away each layer of pretense with surgical precision. The scattered papers revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise, detailed sketches of gallery layouts, chemical formulas in his meticulous handwriting, and correspondence with private collectors who had unknowingly purchased authentic pieces while the gallery displayed his masterful reproductions. "You cannot understand the pressures," he whispered, sinking into his chair with the defeated air of a man whose life's work had been reduced to criminal conspiracy. The board demanded increased revenues while cutting acquisitions, funding, forcing impossible choices between the gallery's reputation and my own survival. Holmes gathered the evidence with methodical care, his grey eyes reflecting neither triumph nor sympathy as he examined each damning document. "Your forgeries were indeed skillful, Sir Edmund, and might have continued indefinitely had you not grown overconfident with the Mask of Sorrows. The elaborate curse mythology was inspired misdirection, designed to discourage close examination while increasing perceived value." He held up a chemical analysis matching Miss Pembroke's professional assessment perfectly. However, Lord Ashford's growing expertise created an unexpected threat to your entire operation. The curator reached for his brandy decanter with shaking hands, his voice growing bitter as the weight of exposure pressed down upon him. 20 years of dedicated service, and they would have dismissed me without pension based on one man's suspicions. Ashford had become insufferably suspicious about authentication procedures, demanding independent verification of pieces he had previously accepted without question. His confession tumbled forth like water through a broken dam. When he insisted on bringing Lady Ashcroft to examine the mask's supernatural properties, I realized her knowledge of historical occultism would immediately expose my fabricated inscriptions. Holmes began his methodical explanation, each detail fitting with chilling precision. The locked room was pure illusion, sustained by your intimate knowledge of the building's construction. You created that duplicate key from the beeswax impression, used the concealed service passage for access, then employed Miss Pembroke's own restoration chemicals to weaken the silk cords supporting your forged mask. His voice carried the authority of absolute certainty. The poison, a crystalline compound applied to the chair's velvet, was activated by body heat and dispersed through carefully manipulated air currents from the heating system you controlled. Miss Pembroke entered at that moment, her face bearing wounded dignity as she confronted her exploiter. "The inscriptions you had me translate, you wrote them yourself, using your classical education to create convincing Latin phrases that would support the mask's reputation while ensuring scholarly examination would reveal their fraudulent nature at precisely the moment you needed suspicion. Elsewhere." Her voice strengthened with growing anger. "My mother's medical expenses, my desperate financial situation, you manipulated everything to ensure my cooperation while positioning me as your convenient scapegoat. The midnight laugh was your theatrical flourish," Holmes continued. "A clockwork mechanism triggered by the severing chords, designed to add supernatural terror to your carefully orchestrated scene. Lady Ashcroft, with her known eccentricities and bitter history with Lord Ashford, became the perfect target for misdirection." Inspector Lestrade stepped forward, finally grasping the full scope of the deception. The threatening letters, the mechanical device, even the timing of Lady Ashcroft's visit, all calculated to create an impossible mystery that would focus suspicion away from the gallery's own administration. Sir Edmund made one desperate lunge toward the hidden panel, but Holmes intercepted him with surprising agility, and the constables quickly secured the defeated curator. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Holmes observed with characteristic detachment. "You made two crucial errors, Sir Edmund. You assumed terror would cloud observation, and you underestimated human integrity. Both prove fatal to men of artifice." The handcuffs clicked shut around Sir Edmund's wrists with metallic finality, yet Holmes remained motionless beside the curator's desk, his keen eyes fixed upon a detail that had escaped our notice during the dramatic confrontation. A thin line of oil marked the edge of the mahogany surface, fresh enough to catch the lamplight with telltale gleam, and from his waistcoat he produced the small brass key we had discovered beneath the window frame earlier in our investigation. "Inspector," he said quietly, his voice carrying that authority that commanded immediate attention. "One thread of this web remains uncut, and until we secure it, our case remains dangerously incomplete." Lestrade paused in his preparations to escort the prisoner, his weathered face reflecting the skepticism of a practical policeman who believed the night's work concluded. "Surely, Mr. Holmes, with Sir Edmund's confession and the overwhelming evidence, we have our murderer securely in hand." Holmes turned the brass key slowly in the lamplight, revealing intricate engravings that spoke of custom craftsmanship and personal pride. "This key bears the initial M worked into its decorative flourishes, Inspector, and its wards are cut for a specific lock that exists nowhere in the Venetian wing. More significantly, the oil upon this desk matches precisely the lubricant used on the mechanical device we discovered in the hidden passage." Sir Edmund's face, already pale with defeat, drained of its remaining color as Holmes continued his methodical analysis. "Your scheme required assistance from someone with intimate knowledge of the gallery's security procedures, someone who could move through these halls without arousing suspicion, and someone whose absence tonight would not be questioned by the remaining staff." He examined the key more closely with his magnifying glass, noting additional details that confirmed his growing suspicions. "Morrison, your senior watchman, signed out early this evening with a convenient illness, leaving young Peters alone to witness the activation of your heating system and nearly pay with his life for that observation." Miss Pembroke stepped forward, her professional composure gradually returning as she processed the implications of Holmes's revelation. "Morrison has been with the gallery for 15 years, she said, her voice steady despite the trauma of discovering how thoroughly she had been manipulated. "He would possess master keys to every section, knowledge of the building's hidden passages, and most importantly, the mechanical expertise to construct and maintain the clockwork device we discovered." Her hands no longer trembled as she spoke, and I recognized the strength that had made her an accomplished restoration specialist despite her youth. Holmes moved to examine the heating controls once more, testing various settings while observing how the air circulation patterns changed throughout the gallery. Timing of the vapors released into the ventilation system was crucial to the success of this second attempted murder, requiring someone to monitor Peters's movements and activate the mechanism at precisely the correct moment. His grey eyes reflected that particular intensity that marked significant developments in his most complex cases. Morrison's knowledge of the watchman's routine would have made such timing elementary, while his access to the administrative offices provided the perfect vantage point for observation. Lestrade immediately dispatched constables to Morrison's residence, though Holmes shook his head with characteristic prescience. "You will find his lodgings empty, Inspector, and his few possessions removed with the efficiency of a man who planned his departure well in advance." He pocketed the brass key with deliberate care, adding it to the growing collection of evidence that would ensure both conspirators faced justice. However, men of Morrison's practical nature rarely abandon valuable tools, and the mechanical device in the hidden passage represents considerable investment in specialized equipment. The November fog had begun to lift outside the gallery windows, revealing the first hints of dawn breaking over London's ancient streets. Yet Holmes showed no inclination to conclude our investigation. "We shall wait," he announced with quiet confidence, settling into Sir Edmund's chair with the patient demeanor of a hunter who understood his quarry's inevitable return. "Morrison will attempt to retrieve his clockwork mechanism before fleeing London permanently, and when he does, we shall be ready to complete the final chapter of this elaborate deception." The mechanical ticking from the hidden passage continued its rhythmic countdown, marking time until the last conspirator would walk into Holmes's carefully prepared trap. The grey November dawn crept through the gallery's tall windows like a reluctant witness, casting long shadows across the marble floors where we had maintained our silent vigil through the small hours of the morning. Holmes remained motionless in Sir Edmund's chair, his keen eyes fixed upon the concealed panel, while the mechanical ticking from within the hidden passage marked time with the persistence of a metallic heartbeat. Inspector Lestrade had positioned his constables strategically throughout the east wing, their presence masked by the classical statuary that lined the gallery walls, and Miss Pembroke sat with quiet dignity near the entrance, determined to witness the conclusion of the conspiracy that had so thoroughly exploited her professional expertise. The first sound was barely perceptible, the whisper of a key against a lock, followed by the soft sigh of well-oiled hinges as the concealed entrance swung open on its hidden pivots. Morrison emerged from the passage with the practiced stealth of a man intimately familiar with every creak and shadow of the building, his weathered face bearing the focused expression of someone retrieving a treasured possession. His hands moved with mechanical precision toward the brass clockwork device, and I could see the pride of craftsmanship in his careful handling of the intricate mechanism that had been central to his elaborate scheme. "Good morning, Morrison," Holmes said with that gentle authority that could freeze a man's blood more effectively than any shout of alarm. "I trust you have come to collect your masterpiece before departing London permanently." The senior watchman's hands trembled as he clutched the brass device, his eyes darting between Holmes and the constables who had emerged from their concealment with practiced efficiency. 25 years of faithful service," Morrison said bitterly, his voice carrying the resentment of a man who felt the world had failed to recognize his true worth, "and they would have dismissed me without pension when the new electrical systems made my position obsolete." Holmes rose from his chair with fluid grace, examining the clockwork mechanism that Morrison still clutched defensively against his chest. "Your engineering skills are remarkable, Morrison. This timing device represents months of careful planning and considerable investment in specialized components. The program wheel studded with pins, the spring barrel mechanism, the dual levers designed to create both the supernatural sound effects and the precise moment of the mask's destruction." His grey eyes reflected genuine appreciation for the technical achievement, even as he condemned its criminal application. Sir Edmund provided the scholarly knowledge of forgery techniques and classical languages, while you contributed the mechanical expertise and intimate knowledge of the gallery's hidden spaces. As Lestrade's constables secured Morrison with professional efficiency, Holmes continued his methodical explanation of the conspiracy's full scope. The duplicate keys, the chemical weakening of the silk cords, the poison applied to Lord Ashford's chair, all timed to coincide with the clockwork device's activation at precisely midnight. Your attempt to eliminate Peters as a witness demonstrated the same mechanical precision, using the heating system to distribute toxic vapors through the ventilation grates. Morrison's shoulders sagged with the weight of complete exposure, and he made no attempt to deny the charges that would inevitably follow. Miss Pembroke stepped forward, her professional dignity fully restored now that her unwitting role in the deception had been thoroughly explained. "The inscriptions you had me translate," she said to the defeated watchman, "were Sir Edmund's creation, designed to support the mask's supernatural reputation while ensuring that scholarly examination would eventually expose their fraudulent nature at precisely the moment suspicion needed to be directed elsewhere." Her voice carried the strength of someone whose expertise had been vindicated and whose integrity had been publicly acknowledged. Inspector Lestrade supervised the removal of both conspirators with evident satisfaction, The case that had begun with such bewildering complexity now resolved through Holmes's characteristic application of methodical observation and logical deduction. "Without your insight, Mr. Holmes," he acknowledged with genuine admiration, "we might have spent months pursuing Lady Ashcroft while the true perpetrators escaped justice entirely." The morning light continued to strengthen, gradually dispelling the shadows that had concealed so much deception and revealing the gallery in all its classical beauty. As we prepared to leave the Meridian Gallery, Holmes paused to examine the empty pedestal, where the mask of sorrows had once rested, its absence now more eloquent than any supernatural curse could have been. "The true tragedy, Watson," he observed with characteristic insight, "lies not in the forgery itself, but in the corruption of legitimate talents for criminal purposes." Both Sir Edmund's scholarly abilities and Morrison's mechanical expertise might have contributed positively to the gallery's mission, had financial desperation not perverted their natural gifts. We emerged into the crisp November morning, where our hansom cab waited to return us to the familiar comfort of Baker Street and the routine of our shared lodgings. The fog had finally lifted completely, revealing London in all its ancient complexity, and I found myself reflecting on the human capacity for both creation and destruction that Holmes's cases so frequently illuminated. "Another remarkable demonstration of your deductive methods, Holmes," I observed as we settled into our seats for the journey home. Holmes reached for his violin case with the satisfaction of a man whose intellectual appetite had been thoroughly satisfied. "The most gratifying element, Watson, was the prevention of a grave miscarriage of justice regarding both Lady Ashcroft and Miss Pembroke. The truth, however elaborate its concealment, inevitably yields to patient observation and systematic analysis." He smiled, that enigmatic expression that always followed the successful conclusion of his most intricate cases. "There are indeed curses in this world, my dear fellow, but they are invariably of human manufacture, and like all human constructions, they can be dismantled by the proper application of reason and evidence." The case of the painted mask had reached its conclusion, leaving behind only the satisfaction of justice served and the enduring reminder that even the most bewildering mysteries yield their secrets to the methodical pursuit of truth.